August 1, 1945. Just past midnight, the streets of Toyama, a city of 150,000 souls, slept under the cover of summer clouds. Children rested on futons, mothers whispered in narrow wooden homes, factory whistles had long gone silent. To the west, faint thunder echoed across the Sea of Japan, but this was no storm. At first, it sounded like waves crashing in the distance, a rolling murmur that rose and fell against the dark horizon. Farmers stirred in their sleep, thinking of rain for their crops. On the outskirts, a watchman leaned against the wooden gate of an aluminum plant and muttered about the weather. Then the sound grew sharper, louder, metallic, hundreds of engines thrumming in unison, vibrating the air until windows rattled in their frames. By the time the first black silhouettes appeared against the moonlit clouds, it was already too late. The Americans had come with more than 170 B-29 superfortresses. Each bomber carried incendiary clusters designed not for single buildings, not for military targets, but for entire cities. In the bomb bays, 1,000 tons of fire waited to fall. For every family asleep in Toyama, there would be 5 bombs. For every square block of the city, 6 clusters of incendiaries. The arithmetic of destruction had been calculated before the planes ever left Guam. Inside one of the B-29s, Sergeant Daniel Riley felt the bomber shudder as bay doors opened. He looked down and saw only darkness. Somewhere below, Toyama stretched like a patchwork of paper and pine. His crew had been briefed. The city was the Manchester of Japan, an industrial hub for ball bearings and aluminum, critical for sustaining what little was left of Japan's war machine. But all he could see was a sea of rooftops waiting for dawn. At 12:45 a.m., the first incendiaries dropped. They whistled through the night, faint at first, like summer cicadas. On the ground, Lieutenant Haruto Ishikawa, a civil defense officer, thought he heard fireworks. Then the first explosions lit the sky. Sticks of fire burst open across entire blocks, showering magnesium and jellied gasoline into wooden homes. The city erupted. Flames leapt from roof to roof in seconds, wind-fed and merciless. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods dissolved into orange seas. The sound Ishikawa had mistaken for fireworks became a continuous roar, wood cracking, oil drums exploding, screams carried on the night air. From above, Riley's crew watched Toyama disappear beneath a quilt of flame. At 1:00 a.m., smoke punched through the cloud layer, orange at its base, black at its crown, visible for miles. The smell of burning pine and rice straw carried upward even into the bomber's cabin. By 2:00 a.m., 95% of Toyama was gone. Whole districts had ceased to exist, replaced by ash and embers. The firestorm sucked the oxygen from basements and shelters, turning them into tombs. Those who fled into rivers watched the flames chase them across the water, sparks hissing as they fell into the currents. When dawn finally broke, the city was unrecognizable. Out of 150,000 residents, more than 30,000 were gone, tens of thousands more wounded or homeless. The once proud industrial hub had been erased in a single night, a casualty not of siege or invasion, but of arithmetic from the sky. And yet for the men who dropped the bombs, Toyama was just another name on a list, another square on a map marked destroyed, another ratio calculated and carried out with mechanical precision. The Japanese High Command had believed Toyama too small, too insignificant to warrant destruction. They had expected the Americans to focus only on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, but the strategy had shifted. Now every city was a target, and Toyama had just become the warning of what was to come. For Lieutenant Ishikawa, stumbling through smoke and bodies as the sun rose, the realization was unbearable. Japan had no answer to this. No defense, no retaliation, no shield. The empire had built its cities from wood and paper. America had turned that decision into kindling. The war had entered its final stage, And Toyama was proof that Japan's defeat would not come from soldiers dying on beaches, but from civilians burned in their homes. The morning after, smoke still clung to Toyama's ruins like a second sky. The mountains that framed the city glowed red with reflection, as though the peaks themselves had caught fire. The air was thick with ash, so dense it coated every breath, turning mouths black and throats raw. Lieutenant Haruto Ishikawa stumbled through the wreckage, his civil defense helmet bent, his uniform burned through at the shoulder. He had spent the night dragging survivors from collapsed homes, only to realize most of the bodies he pulled were lifeless. Their lungs had filled with smoke, their faces gray with soot. The streets where children once played were now alleys of corpses. What struck him most was not the destruction of the factories, nor the collapse of the government offices. It was the absence of sound, no footsteps on the wooden bridges, no cries of merchants at dawn, just silence, broken only by the crackle of embers and the moaning of the few who had survived. He had been trained to expect bombs, but not this. Never this. He had told his men to prepare buckets of water, to cut fire breaks in the streets, to use bamboo poles to douse incendiaries before they spread. Those methods might work against a handful of bombs. They meant nothing against 1,000 tons of them. He realized now the defense drills were little more than theater. Across the city, rivers swelled with the bodies of those who had tried to escape the flames. Families huddled in the shallows, hoping the water would protect them, only to suffocate as the firestorm sucked the oxygen away. Whole districts had vanished into charcoal. Ishikawa's own house, where his wife and child had waited, was now a blackened skeleton of wood. He collapsed to his knees on what had been their street, the ash warm beneath his palms. Around him lay the remains of neighbors he had known since childhood. The war had stretched for nearly a decade, but in that moment he felt it had ended. Not in surrender, not in negotiation, but in annihilation. Far above, back on Guam, the crews of the B-29s that had erased Toyama sat down for breakfast in the mess halls. They ate powdered eggs, drank coffee, smoked cigarettes. For them, Toyama was a mission report. 95% destroyed, industrial facilities eliminated. No American planes lost. Sergeant Daniel Riley signed his name at the bottom of the debrief sheet. He didn't write about the families in the rivers, or the way the fire climbed the sky like a living creature. He wrote only the numbers. Those were all that mattered to command. Numbers, not people, defined the campaign. The commander of XXI Bomber Command, General Curtis LeMay, had calculated that Japan's cities could be incinerated faster than they could recover. Tokyo had burned in March. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe followed. Toyama had simply been next on the list. The men in Washington and Guam did not see villages and memories. They saw industrial output, ball bearings, aluminum stockpiles. They saw percentages of destruction. Tokyo, 51% destroyed. Nagoya, 40%. Kobe, 55%. Toyama, 95%. That figure alone marked it as a success, regardless of how many civilians had died in the firestorm. Back in Japan, word of Toyama spread slowly, carried by rail lines and rumors. Refugees who stumbled into neighboring towns told stories of entire blocks consumed in minutes, of fire racing faster than people could run, of mothers clutching blackened bundles that had once been children. For many Japanese, the destruction of Tokyo had been unbearable but comprehensible. Tokyo was vast, crowded, the seat of power. That it had burned was a tragedy, but in some minds almost inevitable. Toyama was different. Toyama was provincial, a city of craftsmen and farmers, not a capital of empire. Its erasure sent a new message. Nowhere was safe. In Tokyo, the general staff gathered to review reports. The maps laid out on the table showed not only lost battles but lost cities. Where red circles marked Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, now Toyama too was crossed off the map, a void where once there had been streets and factories. One officer asked aloud what many feared. If they can erase Toyama, they can erase any city in Japan. The room fell into silence. There was no rebuttal. Lieutenant Ishikawa, now a hollow-eyed survivor, was summoned weeks later to give testimony about the destruction. His voice shook as he described the firestorm, how the air itself seemed to ignite. He told them about the futility of civil defense, how buckets of water meant nothing against bombs that blanketed entire wards at once. His words carried little weight. By then, the scale of destruction across Japan was so vast that Toyama was one more figure in the catalogue of loss. Yet Ishikawa knew it had been more than that. Toyama had shown the empire that annihilation could arrive not just in the heart of Tokyo, but in the places ordinary Japanese lived, worked, and raised families. For the Americans, it was strategy. For the Japanese, it was terror. At night, Ishikawa lay awake in the ruins of a schoolhouse converted into a shelter. He thought of the sound that had first woken him, the distant rumble mistaken for thunder. He knew now he would never again hear a storm without remembering the night sky filled with B-29s, each carrying enough fire to erase his city. In Guam, Sergeant Riley sat with his crew, smoking under the tropical stars. He thought of the orange glow he had seen from the bomb bay, how it had stretched until it seemed the world itself was burning. He didn't tell his crew that when he closed his eyes, he still saw the outlines of streets dissolving into fire. For both men, the war had distilled into a single truth. Japan's defeat would not come on battlefields, but in firestorms that consumed whole cities. Toyama had been proof. And yet, neither of them knew what was still to come. That Toyama, as devastating as it had been, would soon be overshadowed by destruction on a scale the world had never witnessed. In the weeks that followed Toyama's annihilation, Japan lived in a suspended twilight between disbelief and dread. The survivors staggered from city to city, their stories stitched together in whispers, that the fire had come not like rain but like an ocean crashing down from the heavens, swallowing everything, leaving nothing behind but ash and bones. Train stations filled with families carrying bundles of charred belongings. Mothers clutched children whose hair still smelled of smoke. Farmers who had once brought rice and vegetables to market now stood silent, holding empty baskets. They looked not like refugees of a city, but refugees of an entire civilization that seemed to be vanishing one city at a time. For the Japanese government, Toyama was not just another disaster, it was proof of a pattern. The Americans were no longer striking selectively. They were erasing. General LeMay's bombers operated with mathematical precision like a factory of destruction. Night after night, the B-29s rose from Guam, each packed with tons of incendiaries, and returned at dawn with their bomb bays empty. The war diary entries became almost mechanical. Tokyo 51% destroyed. Nagoya 40%. Kobe 55%. Toyama 95%. The Japanese staff officers stared at the maps, their cities marked by circles that grew into scars. It became harder and harder to find places that were not already burned. The irony was bitter. Japan had built its empire on conquest, expanding outward across Asia, yet now the empire itself was shrinking, consumed not by invading armies but by fire from the sky. Lieutenant Haruto Ishikawa, who had survived Toyama, found himself transferred to Osaka to help coordinate civil defense. But he knew the futility of it. The men he trained dug fire breaks, carried buckets, and practiced smothering bombs with sand. He watched them with a hollow ache in his chest. He had seen firsthand how meaningless such drills were when entire wards could be erased in minutes. At night, as the warning sirens wailed, Ishikawa would look up and see the glow on the horizon, another city burning. He could smell the ash carried by the wind, drifting across prefectures. The firebombings had become so common that the smell of burning wood and flesh no longer shocked the senses. It had become the scent of war itself. In Guam, Sergeant Daniel Riley prepared for yet another mission. The airmen were told that Japan's war industries were crumbling, that every raid brought victory closer. But Riley knew what the maps didn't say. There were no factories left in Toyama, only ruins. Yet they were ordered to fly again because the war demanded not just victories but overwhelming supremacy. He had started to notice how some of the younger crewmen celebrated after missions, boasting about the tons of bombs they had dropped. Riley kept silent. He had looked down through the bomb bay doors too many times, watching the world below dissolve into fire. In the quiet moments, when the engines were a dull hum and the night stretched forever, he wondered if he would ever forget the sight of entire neighborhoods erupting at once, as though the earth itself had betrayed the people who lived there. Japan's leaders clung to illusions of resistance. Newspapers printed stories of kamikaze pilots striking fear into American fleets. But even as those tales were told, ordinary Japanese knew the truth. They could see it in the blackened skeletons of their cities, in the endless funerals, in the way even small towns now dug air raid trenches in their schoolyards. One old man, standing outside the ruins of Toyama's glassworks, summed it up in a single sentence whispered to his grandson. "The empire will not fall on the battlefield. It will burn until nothing is left." By midsummer, the skies themselves had become the enemy. Farmers working their fields stopped and froze whenever they heard the faint drone of engines. Children no longer asked about thunder, they asked if it was bombers. Entire villages would vanish into shelters at the first sound, only to emerge hours later and learn it was just a storm. Fear itself had become a weapon. When Osaka burned, Ishikawa was there. He remembered the way the fire leapt across the canals, how the water boiled in places, trapping people who had tried to escape. He remembered the frantic shouts of firefighters running with useless hoses, the way the flames ignored every effort to control them. He remembered, most of all, the silence after, how in the ashes of a district that had once held 100,000 souls, there was nothing but the wind moving through ruins. He thought back to Toyama, and the night when his city had been erased in one attack. He realized now it had been less an exception than a warning. The Americans had tested their firestorm there, and now they carried it everywhere. On Guam, Riley and his crew received word of Japan's mounting desperation. Rumors spread that surrender might be near. But even so, the orders continued. More targets, more raids, more fire. Riley listened as commanders spoke of Japan as though it were already a corpse. They were just deciding how to carve it. He wondered how much of Japan would be left by the time peace came. The Japanese High Command, locked in its own pride, still issued proclamations of defiance. But the people no longer believed them. In the markets, in the shelters, in the ruins, whispers grew louder. If Toyama could vanish in one night, if Osaka could be reduced to ash, then what city would be next? Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And so the terror spread faster than the bombs themselves. Every family lived with the knowledge that they might wake to fire, that their street might vanish before sunrise, that their children might suffocate in the night. The firebombings had become not just a military campaign but a psychological siege. For Ishikawa, every mission was the same nightmare repeating: fire from the sky, streets collapsing into flame, families lost in the smoke. For Riley, every mission was another entry in the logbook, another number to add to the tally. Both men knew in their own ways that the war was reaching a climax. But neither could yet imagine how final, how absolute, that climax would be. For while fire had consumed Toyama and dozens of other cities, the Americans were preparing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, one that would make even the destruction of 95% of a city seem small. By late July 1945, the war in Japan was a war of smoke and silence. Cities that had once been alive with the hum of bicycles, the chatter of merchants, and the clatter of factories now stood in ruins. Blackened timbers jutted from the earth like the ribs of some enormous carcass. In Toyama, the few survivors who remained searched daily through ashes that still smoldered weeks after the firestorm. They pulled out half-melted teapots, fragments of tatami mats, and bones that crumbled when touched. Lieutenant Haruto Ishikawa returned briefly to what had been his city, escorted by other civil defense officers. The silence was suffocating. Even the insects seemed to avoid the ruins. Where the bustling Manchester of Japan had once stood, he found only a desert of ash. Whole streets were gone, their outlines marked only by faint lines of melted roof tiles. He paused at the ruins of the school where he had once lectured volunteers on how to extinguish incendiaries. There was nothing left but the cracked foundation. The irony was unbearable. Standing amid the destruction, Ishikawa understood for the first time that the war had already been lost. The empire's leaders might speak of victory, of kamikaze sacrifices, of fighting to the last man. But here, in the ruins of Toyama, their words rang hollow. What army could fight when its cities no longer existed? What defense could stop fire from the sky? Far to the south, in Guam, Sergeant Daniel Riley prepared once again for a mission. He was no longer surprised by the briefings. The maps placed before them were not of fortresses or airfields but of cities, each marked with a red circle. Industrial targets, the commanders said, though Riley knew better. He had stared down at Toyama, and he had seen that there were no distinctions from above. There was only fire, spreading across everything without mercy. The crews were told that the Japanese were near collapse, that their supply chains were shattered, their navy sunk, their air force a shadow. Yet the missions continued. Each flight carried the same rhythm. Engines roaring to life, bomb bays filled, takeoff into the endless Pacific, the long stretch of hours in the dark, then the moment when the coast of Japan came into view, black beneath them, waiting. Riley had stopped asking questions. He dropped the bombs as ordered, watching the earth light up beneath him, whole neighborhoods bursting into flame. He told himself it was duty. He told himself it was war. But in the quiet after landing, when the bomb bay was empty and the engines cooled, he wondered how many more cities could be burned before there was nothing left to destroy. In Tokyo, the military council met behind closed doors, their discussions edged with desperation. Reports came in daily: Toyama 95% destroyed, Fukui 80%, Shizuoka, Oita, Kagoshima all gone. The lists were endless. Staff officers marked them on maps, but soon the maps themselves became meaningless. The red circles bled into one another until Japan itself looked consumed. The generals spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of resisting to the last. But beneath the words, an unspoken truth lingered. They had no way to stop what was happening. Their fighters could barely reach the altitudes of the B-29s. Their anti-aircraft guns were too few, their ammunition dwindling. For every bomber shot down, 100 more arrived. Ishikawa sat in one of those council meetings, a token representative from the civil defense units. He listened as men in immaculate uniforms debated abstractions, while outside the capital itself was blackened ruins. He wanted to shout, to tell them that the people no longer believed, that they could see the futility with their own eyes. But he said nothing. His words would not matter. What struck him most was the way the generals spoke of Toyama as though it were merely a line on a report. 95% destroyed, one officer said, with the same tone he might use to recite a weather forecast. For Ishikawa, Toyama was not a statistic. It was his home. It was the faces of neighbors lost, the sound of children's screams, the smell of bodies buried in ash. But in the mouths of those men it was reduced to numbers. Riley, too, lived with numbers. His logbook was filled with them: 12 tons of incendiaries dropped, 4 hours and 36 minutes of flight, altitude 9,800 feet, target completely destroyed. He sometimes stared at the entries, his pencil strokes neat and precise, and felt a cold detachment. The book did not record the screams, the panic, the firestorms. It did not record the lives beneath those numbers. By August, whispers reached even the bomber crews. A new weapon was coming, something beyond fire, beyond explosives. Riley heard it first in the mess hall, a rumor passed along by a pilot who claimed to have overheard intelligence officers. The talk was vague, cloaked in secrecy, but it was said to be a bomb that could do in one strike what hundreds of B-29s did in a night. Riley dismissed it at first. Nothing could be greater than the firestorms he had seen. But then he remembered Toyama gone in a single raid and wondered if the Americans sought to go further still. In Japan, Ishikawa walked through a hospital filled with burn victims. The smell of charred flesh lingered despite the disinfectants. Nurses moved silently, their faces masks of exhaustion. Children whimpered, their bodies wrapped in bandages that needed constant changing. Ishikawa bent to comfort a boy who had lost his entire family in the Toyama fire. The boy asked only one question: "Will it happen again?" Ishikawa had no answer. What neither he nor Riley knew was that even as Toyama's ashes cooled, decisions had already been made far away in Washington and Tokyo. The Americans no longer planned to merely burn cities. They intended to end the war with a single, decisive blow, using a weapon the world had never seen. And Toyama, erased in one night, stood as the harbinger of what was to come. The fire had been terrifying enough, but what awaited Japan would make the destruction of 95% of a city seem like a prelude. August 6, 1945. The morning broke across the Japanese mainland with a deceptive calm. The sky was pale, the sun filtering weakly through summer clouds. From the ruins of Toyama to the partially rebuilt streets of Osaka, civilians went about their routines with the weight of firestorms in their minds. Children played cautiously in streets still pocked with debris. Farmers tended scorched fields, their crops reduced to blackened stalks. The war, which had already consumed so much, now threatened to strike in ways no one could anticipate. Lieutenant Haruto Ishikawa rose before dawn. He moved silently through the remains of what had once been a bustling district of Toyama. The ash underfoot had hardened overnight, forming a crust over the rubble, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in every corner. He could still see the shadows of houses that had vanished, their outlines etched into the earth. Every step was a reminder of the lives and streets that no longer existed. Reports had started arriving. Tokyo had been attacked again, Hiroshima was experiencing heavy air raids, and word from military intelligence hinted at a new weapon capable of erasing a city with a single strike. The implications chilled him more than any firestorm ever could. Toyama had been a lesson, but the world was about to move beyond lessons into annihilation. Across the Pacific, Sergeant Daniel Riley prepared his B-29 for yet another mission. The crew knew that they were at the cusp of history, though few grasped the full meaning of what awaited them. Riley had flown countless missions over Japanese cities, each one more devastating than the last. The destruction of Toyama remained etched in his memory, streets dissolving into flames, rivers swelling with panic, homes vaporized in seconds. But the orders were clear. They were to continue, each mission more precise, more destructive, until Japan's capacity to fight was eliminated. In the cities, the psychological impact of these attacks had taken root. Children no longer played in open fields after sunset. Families slept in trenches, in caves, or wherever shelter could be improvised. The fear of fire from the sky was constant. The roar of distant engines meant only one thing: destruction might be coming next. Even in remote villages, people whispered about Toyama, the city that had vanished almost entirely in a single night, and what that could mean for them. By midday, the first reports of the new weapon reached Ishikawa. Hiroshima had been destroyed in an instant. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The sheer magnitude of death and devastation defied comprehension. Toyama, terrible as it had been, was now almost unimaginable in comparison. He wandered through the streets, holding the hand of a boy whose family had been lost to the firestorms, and wondered how Japan could possibly endure this. The pattern was clear. Cities could no longer defend themselves. Civilians were not collateral damage, they were the message. Riley, high above the mainland in the cockpit, saw only targets. He saw buildings, rivers, bridges, and streets, each one marked for destruction. He had flown over Toyama months earlier and witnessed the inferno consume everything below. Now, as his plane cut across the sky above Hiroshima, he understood the new weapon was beyond fire and beyond calculation. Yet the mission orders remained the same: drop the bomb, ensure the target is destroyed, return home. There was no room for moral hesitation in the logbooks or in the chain of command. As the bomb fell, Ishikawa felt the earth tremble. The city below Hiroshima vanished in a blinding flash. Waves of heat rolled across the landscape, sweeping everything in a radius beyond imagination. Survivors were instantly vaporized, streets became molten, and the horizon glowed with a fire unlike any air raid. In that moment, the cumulative terror that had begun with Toyama crystallized. The message was unmistakable: Japan could no longer fight back in any meaningful way. Its cities, its people, its very way of life were now vulnerable to instantaneous annihilation. In the aftermath, Ishikawa walked among the few who survived. Words failed him. The smell of burning, of flesh and metal, of ash and radiation, filled every corner of what remained. Families that had once fled Toyama now faced the same fate elsewhere. Children who had survived one firestorm were caught in another, their innocence stripped by relentless, impersonal destruction from above. Toyama had been the warning. Hiroshima was the proof. Riley landed back on Guam after the mission, shaken not by fear for himself but by the enormity of what had occurred. The destruction was total, beyond anything he had seen over Toyama or Osaka. It was efficient, final, absolute. He looked at his crew and saw the same mix of awe and horror mirrored in their faces. They had been instruments of history, and history had left nothing untouched. Back in Tokyo, the emperor's voice finally broke the silence. Japan would surrender. Toyama had already shown the futility of resistance, and now the cities themselves had been turned into instruments of despair. The empire's fate had been sealed not just in battlefields, but in the destruction of its homes, its people, and its very spirit. Ishikawa returned to the ruins of Toyama one final time. The city was unrecognizable, reduced to ash, rubble, and the faint outline of streets that no longer existed. He touched the cracked earth where his house had stood. The lesson of Toyama had been cruel but clear. Japan had underestimated the reach, precision, and relentlessness of American power. Firestorms could erase cities. Bombs could erase entire populations. The combination left nothing. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Riley polished his B-29 after the final missions, filing reports, but the memories of Toyama, Hiroshima, and every city in between lingered in his mind. Numbers on paper did not capture the cries, the panic, or the human suffering beneath. Yet for commanders, the numbers sufficed. For soldiers, the reality could not be ignored. Toyama had been destroyed almost entirely in one night, a single prelude to a campaign that would leave the Japanese mainland scarred, terrified, and finally surrendering. The arithmetic of destruction, begun with incendiary bombs, had reached its apotheosis, and when history looked back, Toyama would stand as the first city whose near-total destruction signaled the futility of resistance and the overwhelming supremacy of the forces that had made it ash. For the survivors, for the families who had once walked its streets, Toyama remained a memory of fire, smoke, and absence. For the men who flew over it, it remained a mission, a number, a calculation executed with ruthless precision. And for history itself, it became a benchmark. 95% of a city, destroyed in a single night, never to rise again. The echoes of Toyama would linger in the minds of every Japanese citizen who witnessed its erasure, and in every American airman who delivered it. It had been a city, a home, a symbol. Now it was a lesson, one that Japan could never unlearn, one that proved the relentless, terrifying reality of war carried out from the skies. The war was over, but Toyama's fire would burn in memory long after the last smoke had cleared.